In a village ruled by whispers and judgment, a young widow struggles alone to support her son, defying prejudice by repairing carriages, a skill deemed unsuitable for a woman. When a nobleman's wagon breaks down amid cruel laughter and doubt, she's openly mocked, told she could never fix it. Yet, beneath skeptical eyes, she takes up tools, courage, and quiet dignity, mounting not only a wheel, but a stand against their scorn. Rain had been threatening since morning, and now it had fallen with a steady persistence that turned the village green into a spongy, glistening stretch of muck. The air in Thistlebrook hung thick with dampness, the kind that pressed into clothes and seeped through souls, carrying the scent of wet earth and chimney smoke. Water dripped from the eaves of narrow cottages, trailed down moss-darkened stone, and pooled beneath the spoked wheels of carts left idle near the smithy. Eleanor Hargrave stepped carefully around the slick ruts as she crossed the square, her skirts already spattered with brown. Jamie, her son, clung to her hand, trying to keep pace with her brisk stride. The hood of her cloak was pushed back, revealing her linen cap and the wisps of dark brown hair that had slipped loose from the braid beneath. Her apron, tied tightly over a worn russet gown, bore the faint smudge of grease and the sharper stain of iron dust, both faded from repeated washings. She had no time to fuss with appearances. She needed a bolt, half worn would do, from the forge if she wanted to finish the job for Mr. Kenley before sundown. The cart's rear pin had sheared off clean, and the smithy might be her only chance at salvaging the repair. She was nearly there when the noise began, a sharp cry from the far end of the road, the sudden clatter of hooves on wet stone, and a shout, half alarm, half frustration. Eleanor stopped mid-step and turned toward the sound, blinking through the mist. Just past the inn, a fine carriage had ground to an awkward halt. The vehicle leaned heavily to one side, its front left wheel fractured at the base of the axle. The rim had split clean through, and the hub, forced down by the weight, was already sinking into the wet road. One of the horses let out a high, agitated snort, stamping its hooves as the driver leapt from his perch and moved to calm them. The coach was well made, though streaked with mud and dulled by the weather. Gilding on the doorframe caught a faint gleam where the rain hadn't dulled it, and the polished glass windows were streaked but unbroken. A crest, barely visible through the grime, was painted above the handle. Eleanor didn't recognize it. Around her, other villagers began to converge with the casual, expectant curiosity of people well accustomed to watching others falter. Men with belts full of tools and the clink of ale on their breath ambled toward the scene, their boots squelching through the sodden turf. Some stood with arms folded, others offered perfunctory comments. "Likely snapped it back on the moor track," muttered one, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his coat. "Should have changed the rim in York," said another, too proud to check the wheel before setting out. The driver, a wiry man with water running down his cheeks, glanced at the gathering crowd and then bent to examine the damage himself. "We hit a rut coming down the ridge," he said, voice tight. "No hope of getting a replacement here, is there?" A few half-hearted suggestions followed, spoken more for the benefit of the audience than out of any real desire to assist. The air had turned sharp and restless, the way it did when men sensed spectacle on the horizon. Eleanor hesitated. Jamie was already tugging at her sleeve, distracted by the horses. She should have kept walking. She had her own work waiting, and no reason to step into the middle of another man's problem. But something in the tilt of the wheel caught her eye. A clean break, a familiar splintering pattern where the grain of the wood had twisted from pressure and damp. She had seen it before. She knew how to brace it. Without asking permission, Eleanor stepped forward, drawing immediate attention. Her boots sank slightly into the road, but she paid it no mind. She moved past the ring of men, knelt beside the broken wheel, and placed one hand gently on the rim, studying the angle where the joint had collapsed. A burst of laughter followed. "Someone call for a dressmaker," came a voice. "She's lost her way to the laundry," someone else offered. "You'll never be able to fix it," a man behind her called, his voice laced with amusement. "Better sew a hem than meddle with iron." Another round of laughter. Eleanor said nothing. Her face flushed. Not from humiliation, but from the familiar struggle to remain composed. She'd been laughed at before. She would be again. But the wheel wasn't beyond saving. It was cracked through the outer rim, yes, but the iron brace hadn't fully detached. With a custom-fitted band and pressure mounting at the correct point, the axle could take weight again, at least long enough to get the carriage off the road and to proper shelter. She ran her fingers along the splintered edge, testing the give of the wood. Rain soaked through the sleeves of her gown and chilled her skin. But she didn't move. She didn't look at them. Let them jeer. Let them guess. After another long moment, she rose. Her skirts clung to her shins, heavy with mud. She turned to the driver and spoke quietly. "If I can fetch my tools, I'll brace the wheel. You'll need a full replacement before York, but I can make it hold long enough to move the coach." The man stared at her, uncertain. Before he could reply, another voice behind him cut in with dry amusement. "She's serious? She'll have the whole thing falling apart before it moves 10 feet. Eleanor didn't wait for approval. She turned away, reaching for Jamie's hand. He was quiet, his eyes wide as he looked up at her. They walked together through the muck, heading for the smithy. The forge's roofline was barely visible now through the mist and smoke drifting from the nearby chimneys. Behind them, the muttering resumed, scoffing, a few exaggerated impressions of a woman with a hammer, and one loud guffaw that trailed after them like smoke. But one man had not laughed. He stood apart from the others, near the door of the stalled coach, his figure tall and still beneath the shadow of a wide traveling cloak. The hood was drawn back, revealing black hair damp with rain, and a face both striking and restrained, as if carved with quiet intention rather than ornament. His arms were folded, not in judgment, but in consideration. His eyes, dark, thoughtful, followed Eleanor with unwavering attention, as though he saw not a woman covered in mud and ridicule, but someone worth watching. Sebastian Greystone, though the villagers didn't know the name yet, said nothing. He simply watched her walk away. Eleanor reached the smithy's door, one hand already lifting to knock, when a voice called out behind her, deep, clear, and unmistakably directed at her. "Madam, wait." The voice stopped her mid-step. Eleanor turned slowly, her fingers still curled around the edge of the smithy's door, heart thudding in her chest. The hinges gave a long creak as the door swung wider behind her, letting out a gust of warm air that smelled of scorched coal and charred metal. Outside, the rain had eased into a mist, but the cold had deepened, settling into her skin like a second weight. The man walking toward her was tall and straight-backed, his dark wool cloak hanging heavily around his shoulders, its hem wet and trailing grime from the road. His boots struck the ground without hurry, though there was something about the precision of his steps that marked him apart from the others. Deliberate, practiced, not careless like the men who lingered with folded arms and idle mouths. He stopped several feet from her, the rain sheeting quietly off the brim of his hat, revealing a face drawn not with age, but with something quieter. Thought, weariness, contained unease. "I'm Mr. Greystone," he said. No more than that. No mention of title, no offered hand. His voice was low, refined, but edged with restraint. Not haughty, just careful. His accent marked him clearly, upper class, southern, but not the performative sort that filled parlors in York with pomp and condescension. This voice was quieter, more tempered, but unmistakably not of Thistlebrook. And in his eyes, hazel, deep-set, watching her with unsettling directness, there was the unmistakable gleam of a man not used to being questioned, but not fond of commanding, either. He inclined his head slightly, rain threading through his black hair where it curled at the ends. "I wanted to thank you. For offering assistance, I mean. The coachman didn't expect a wheel to give way so close to the village." Eleanor didn't look toward the villagers still gathered along the edge of the green. She could feel their stares like thorns on her back. Jamie stood behind her now, his small fingers gripping her skirt in silent curiosity. "I didn't offer out of charity," she said quietly. "If I can help, I will. That's all." Greystone glanced toward the coach, still leaning at an awkward tilt. "Do you truly believe it can be repaired here? Or would it be wiser to send to York for a replacement?" She studied him for a moment. The question wasn't condescending. He was asking as if he meant it. "Yes," she answered after a moment. "The damage is bad, but not beyond mending. If I can get a fitted brace from the smithy, or the raw iron to make one, and use my own tools, I can mount the wheel again. It won't last beyond the next turnpike, but it should be enough to get the coach into shelter." Greystone's jaw tightened slightly. The tension was not directed at her, but rather at the situation itself. "How long?" "An hour," she said. "Less, if the fittings hold." He nodded once, the motion curt but decisive. "You'll have what you need. My driver will assist." The decision, made so quickly and without hesitation, drew a soft murmur from the bystanders. Men shifted uneasily, their amusement soured by the gentleman's trust. That this stranger, clearly of higher station, would place his confidence in Eleanor, a woman with dirt beneath her nails and no last name worth repeating, was almost offensive to them. Footsteps sounded behind her. Eleanor turned as Mr. Aldridge emerged from the smithy, arms crossed over his barrel chest. His brows were drawn in a solid line across his forehead, and the corners of his mouth twitched in displeasure. He looked from her to Greystone and back again, weighing the cost of opposition. It was plain he didn't like the idea of granting her anything, especially not in front of the men who watched his forge like a public stage. But neither could he afford to offend a paying nobleman, especially one who might carry word of the encounter beyond the moor. At last, with a tone dry enough to cut through mist, he said, "There's scrap iron near the back. If she's to use it, she'll clean up after." He didn't wait for a reply. The door swung open behind him and closed with a thud. Eleanor exhaled, short and shallow. She stepped aside, guiding Jamie inside with a hand at his shoulder. The forge was warm, the fire low in its pit, casting dull orange light against the soot-black walls. The smell of smoke and metal wrapped around her like an old coat. She pulled off her damp cloak and draped it over a peg, pushing up the sleeves of her gown. There was no need for pleasantries. She worked. Jamie settled himself on a bench near the back wall, legs swinging. His eyes followed her every movement, how she selected a length of iron, measured it twice against a wooden rod, and marked it with chalk. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, filing the splintered edge of the wheel's brace, smoothing the surface where it had cracked from pressure and wet. Greystone remained outside, his presence a weight Eleanor could feel through the wall. Occasionally, the door creaked and opened to allow the driver inside with a bucket or tool she had asked for. But Greystone did not follow. He stayed near the coach, where the men continued to linger, muttering now with less confidence. Time passed slowly, punctuated only by the rasp of metal on stone and the hiss of iron meeting water. The minutes dragged like hours. Eleanor's shoulders began to ache from holding her position so long. Mud clung to her hem, soaking through to her stockings. Her hands, though skilled, had begun to cramp with cold. Still, she did not stop. Piece by piece, she fitted the band. The first brace was riveted, the second bent with heat and placed with tongs. A third she hammered into shape using a curved iron base, her brow furrowed, her lips pressed in concentration. Outside, the sky darkened further, though the rain had quieted to a damp hush. Villagers had begun to drift off, boredom outweighing their hunger for humiliation. Only a few remained, those with too little work and too much time. At last, she wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and stepped back to examine her work. The band sat evenly, the tension distributed along the rim. It would hold. Not forever, but enough. She called for the driver and motioned him toward the coach. Jamie stood quietly and walked toward her, his small boots tapping lightly on the stone floor. His cheeks were pink from the warmth of the forge. Eleanor moved toward the coach, With the driver's help, she lifted the wheel, slowly, carefully into place, bracing it with her shoulder as he slid the axle pin through the opening. The weight bore down on her spine. Every muscle in her back screamed, but the brace held. One more bolt, just one, and it would be secure. She leaned forward, reaching for it, and behind her, a loud crack split the air. Jamie screamed. Eleanor spun toward the sound of her son's cry, her heart lurching violently. Jamie lay on the ground near the edge of the forge's stone floor, one boot pinned beneath a slab of broken rock that had slipped loose from the stack behind the bench. His small hands clutched at the dirt, his face scrunched in pain, and fresh tears carved streaks through the grime on his cheeks. She dropped the bolt instantly and rushed to him, her knees hitting the muddy ground without thought. "Jamie," she breathed, voice sharp with panic. Her hands fumbled at his foot, trying to pry the stone free, but it was wedged tight against the side of his ankle. He whimpered, and guilt sliced through her with the precision of a blade. She should never have brought him here. She should have left him with Mrs. Dobbs, or in the back room with his toys. But she'd thought, foolishly, that this would take no more than an hour, that he could sit quietly and watch. "Allow me," came a voice beside her, low and steady. She looked up to find Mr. Greystone kneeling opposite her, the hem of his coat trailing in the mud. He said nothing more, only reached down with careful fingers and braced the stone. In one measured movement, he lifted it and set it aside, then cradled Jamie's foot gently in one gloved hand. Jamie's breath hitched, but he didn't scream, his wide eyes turned up to the stranger with uncertain trust. "It's not broken," Greystone murmured after a moment, "only bruised." Eleanor hovered close, her palms flat against the wet earth. Jamie reached instinctively for her, and she gathered him into her arms, cradling his head beneath her chin. His body trembled, and she could feel the thinness of his frame through the fabric of his coat. The crowd, still lingering on the green, had gone quieter. She could hear them talking low, no longer loud enough to be heard clearly, but their intent unmistakable. They were enjoying the spectacle. The woman who dared put her hands on a nobleman's coach now cradling a crying child, her skirts muddied, her hair sticking to her face. Greystone stood and stepped back to give her room. He looked at her, not with pity, but with something else, something steadier, a recognition of sorts. She couldn't name it. She shifted Jamie gently into a seated position on the bench where he'd started the afternoon. He winced as she lifted his leg, then relaxed when she pulled off the boot and saw only swelling, a scrape just above the ankle. The skin would bruise, but not break. He would walk again tomorrow. The real wound was her own shame, sharp and exposed. She turned her face toward the coach, her breath caught between decision and dread. The wheel wasn't finished. The brace was in place, but the last bolt still lay waiting in the mud. The axle needed final securing, and without it, the entire repair would come apart with the coach's first lurch forward. She stood, torn between her son's comfort and the promise she had made. She reached for the edge of the bench, her hands unsteady, her voice thick. I'll stay with him," Greystone said, softly but firmly. She met his eyes again. For a long moment she held his gaze, trying to see past the calm. A nobleman offering to mind a child in the middle of a village green was not something she had ever known to be anything but a gesture, a mask. But his stillness wasn't performative. He didn't speak for the crowd, and he didn't look to them for approval. He looked only at her, as though her decision mattered, not just for the coach, but for herself. Eleanor swallowed hard. She gave a slight nod. Then she turned. She returned to the wheel, fingers stiff with cold and filth, and picked up the final bolt. Her back ached, and her knees were sore from kneeling. Her skirts clung heavy to her legs, sodden and dark with rain and forge soot. But she moved with renewed urgency, her hands working faster, her breath sharp with focus. The brace sat firm. She bent low to test its weight again, placing her shoulder beneath the rim of the wheel. With the driver's help, she hoisted it upward, her spine straining as the full burden of the axle bore down through her arms and into her legs. The wheel lifted into place, aligned, just enough. Sweat slicked her brow. The pressure in her arms became a roaring heat, but she held. The driver crouched beside her, bolting the brace tight. The iron groaned under the strain, but did not shift. Eleanor reached for the final nut, twisted it down, and gave it one last wrench with the spanner. The coach creaked ominously as it was lowered inch by inch onto its wheels. The driver stepped back. A long silence followed. And then, balance. The coach sat straight. The brace held. The axle no longer sagged. For the first time in an hour, Eleanor let herself breathe. Not fully, not freely, but enough. Enough to feel the barest whisper of relief. The murmurs had stilled. No jeering. No laughter. Only the faint hiss of rain dripping from the eaves, and the sound of breath, hers and the driver's. She stepped back, her hands trembling, her arms too weak now to lift anything more. She wiped her palms against her apron, not that it made any difference. The cloth was soaked through. She turned toward Jamie. He was sitting still, Greystone beside him on the bench. The boy leaned slightly against the man's side, not quite touching, but not fearful. Greystone had one arm across the back of the bench, his posture relaxed but attentive, his gaze flickering between the child and the coach. His expression was unreadable, though something in the set of his mouth hinted at satisfaction, not at her performance, but at the silence that followed it. Even Aldridge stood motionless now, arms folded, his face closed. Whether it was anger or astonishment, she couldn't tell. Eleanor allowed herself one moment, just one, to rest her weight on her heels and draw a long breath. And then it happened. A voice cut through the air like a drawn blade, sharp, cold, and unmistakably feminine. "Well, so this is what passes for competence now?" Eleanor turned slowly. Mrs. Huxley stood at the edge of the green, shawl drawn tight around her bony shoulders, her chin lifted in righteous disapproval. Her pale grey dress, fine and dry beneath her umbrella, gleamed in contrast to the mud-splattered ground. Her eyes, pale and narrow, moved over the scene with the practiced gaze of a woman who had passed judgment long before she'd spoken it. She did not look at Eleanor when she spoke next. Her gaze landed squarely on Sebastian Greystone. "Mr. Greystone," she said, her voice clipped. "You would do well not to mistake charity for capability." And Eleanor realized the wheel was not the only thing she would have to defend today. Mrs. Huxley's voice, cold and unmistakably audible to all gathered, settled over the green like a wet shroud. There was a pause, a brief moment of silence in which even the wind seemed to still, and then the first whisper broke through like a snapped twig. She called him Mr. Greystone, didn't she? Did you see the way he looked at her? Standing there like that, covered in soot, child in tow. She thinks fixing a wheel makes her a lady. The muttering rippled outward, soft at first, then emboldened by the shared thrill of gossip catching flame. What had been quiet derision throughout the afternoon now bloomed into open speculation. Eleanor could feel it pressing in from every direction. It curled around her like smoke from a dying fire, sharp, acrid, persistent. She didn't have to hear every word. She had heard enough. She straightened slowly, the wrench still in her hand. Her palms were blackened with grease, the skin raw beneath her nails. Jamie leaned lightly against her leg, his injured foot now tucked beneath him, his weight no burden but his silence somehow heavier than before. Across from her, Mrs. Huxley moved forward, gliding rather than walking, her posture rigid beneath the layers of grey wool and lace that fell over her bony frame. The umbrella she held was more ornament than necessity now, as the rain had ceased, but she wielded it with the same purpose as a soldier might a saber, an extension of authority. Her eyes, narrowed and pale, moved from Eleanor to Jamie, and then, most damningly, to Sebastian Greystone, who remained standing beside the repaired coach. Mrs. Huxley tilted her chin ever so slightly, just enough to speak to him, without deigning to face Eleanor again. "You are, of course, welcome to stay at the inn, sir. There is no need to loiter near that woman's forge." That woman. As though Eleanor stood within earshot only by accident. As though she hadn't earned every breath she took that day. Sebastian didn't respond at once. The set of his shoulders remained unchanged, but the lines of his face had grown tighter. There was no smirk, no scoffing reply, only the quiet flex of his jaw as his gaze shifted toward Eleanor. He seemed to weigh the moment in silence, and though he did not speak, that silence itself felt laced with something, tension certainly, frustration, something unspoken and possibly unnameable. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor saw the driver moving around the horses, checking harnesses and adjusting the angle of the repaired wheel. The activity marked the shift more keenly than any word might have. The coach would depart soon. The moment, whatever it had been or might have become, was dissolving under the weight of watchful eyes and centuries-old rules. She said nothing. What was there to say? She knelt beside Jamie again and lifted him carefully into her arms. He winced as she shifted his weight, but wrapped his arms around her neck without a sound. His small body pressed close to hers, and she tucked his head beneath her chin, shielding him from the murmurs that still echoed like flies buzzing through tall grass. The strength she had clung to during the repair, the raw, single-minded focus, was ebbing now, and what was left behind was the slow, aching sting of humiliation. Not for what she'd done, for how easily it could be dismissed. She had worked, sweat bled beneath the eyes of men who had mocked her and still walked away with nothing but laughter. Worse, she had accepted help from a man whose kindness, however sincere, could be turned against her with a single well-placed comment. She gathered her tools in silence, placing them in her canvas satchel with careful movements. The driver called out softly to the footman. The door to the coach creaked open. Eleanor didn't look up. And then, his footsteps. Slow, measured, unmistakable. She turned as Sebastian approached, his gloved hand reaching into his coat pocket. He drew out a coin, round, polished, bright even in the gray light. Gold, not silver, not copper. Gold. "I owe you," he said, voice low. It wasn't the same tone he'd used earlier, not the gentle inquiry or quiet gratitude. This was something cooler, public, a deliberate step backward. Eleanor looked at the coin in his outstretched hand, her fingers still clutched around Jamie's shoulder. She didn't reach for it. The edge of the coin gleamed beneath a layer of rainwater and smudged sweat. A sovereign, more than a week's wages for a tradesman. The pause hung heavy. The villagers had stilled again, watching with renewed intensity. The widow and the gentleman, the coin between them. She didn't take it. Instead, she turned her palm and let it fall. The coin hit the ground with a soft thud, sinking slightly into the mud. A collective intake of breath followed, quiet, but audible. Even Mr. Aldridge, standing near the forge, blinked in surprise. Sebastian didn't bend to retrieve it. He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze catching hers with something unspoken. Not offense, not frustration, perhaps regret. Perhaps apology. Or perhaps something closer to understanding. A recognition that whatever kindness he might offer her would always be twisted by the eyes of those who had already decided what she was. He inclined his head slightly, then turned. Eleanor watched him walk away. The footman closed the coach door behind him. The driver called to the horses, clicking his tongue. The repaired wheel groaned once as the coach shifted forward. But it held. It turned. It moved. And then the coach rolled slowly away from the square, the crowd parting to let it pass. No one cheered. No one clapped. They simply stared as the figure inside disappeared beyond the bend in the road. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, Jamie warm in her arms, her tools weighing down her shoulder. The square was quieter now. The villagers began to scatter. Rain trickled again from the rooftops, a slow drip of water ticking against wood and stone. But Mrs. Huxley remained. She approached with slow, deliberate steps, pausing beside Eleanor as though they were merely passing acquaintances sharing a quiet afternoon. "There are consequences for being seen, Mrs. Hargrave," she murmured. The words were soft, but laced with satisfaction. Then she moved on, her shoes barely making a sound as she vanished into the mist. Eleanor lifted her chin. She did not watch the woman go. She turned instead toward the forge, adjusted her grip on Jamie, and began walking. The weight of her son was familiar. So was the weight of disgrace. She had carried both before. They reached the corner of the lane, just beyond the edge of the green, where the trees grew closer and the houses began to thin. The ground was uneven here, the path narrower, rutted from cartwheels and the season's constant rain. She adjusted Jamie against her hip, then felt his fingers tug lightly at her sleeve. "Mama?" She stopped. He looked up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Someone's following us." Eleanor turned sharply, her grip tightening around Jamie's small frame. The shadows stretched long across the lane now, crawling over the crooked stone cottages as the sun began its slow descent behind the moors. The air was cool and thick with the smell of damp earth and chimney smoke, and for a heartbeat, all was still. Then, emerging from the narrowing path behind them, came a figure. A boy, perhaps 13 or 14, barefoot, despite the mud and chill. His trousers were patched, his shirt collar blackened with soot, and a streak of ash marked his cheek like a careless brush of charcoal. He walked with quick steps, but kept a deliberate distance, his eyes shifting between Eleanor and the fading light beyond the lane. "Mrs. Hargrave," he called, hesitant and breathless. Eleanor stepped slightly in front of Jamie, her brows lifting in cautious acknowledgement. "Yes?" The boy halted, pushing his damp hair from his forehead. I'm Thomas. From the inn. Stable boy." She relaxed, just barely. She recognized the name now. She'd seen him brushing the bays behind the tavern more than once, always underfoot but quiet, with the look of someone used to being ignored. He fidgeted now, his thin shoulders twitching as though he feared he'd be chased away before he could speak. "I was sent," he said, glancing around. "There's a message from Mr. Greystone." She blinked, startled. "He sent you?" Thomas nodded, his gaze darting to Jamie. "He said to tell you he wishes a word. Not at the inn. He said too many eyes there. He said the chapel lane. At dusk." Eleanor's heartbeat quickened. The chapel lane. That narrow stretch of gravel and moss, just beyond the overgrown churchyard, was a place rarely traveled after sunset. It was quiet, bordered by thorny hedges and a crumbling stone wall, and far enough from the square to be out of sight. Safe in its seclusion, and dangerous for exactly that reason. She said nothing at first. Jamie leaned sleepily into her shoulder, and the weight of the day seemed to press more deeply into her bones. She should say no. Should send word that she was not a woman to be summoned in shadows. But curiosity caught her. More than curiosity. A quiet, aching unrest. After the silence. After the humiliation. Why would he seek her out? What did he think remained between them? Did he say why? She asked softly. Thomas looked down, his bare toes curling in the mud. "No, ma'am. Only that he wouldn't keep you long. And that it mattered." Eleanor nodded once. "Thank you. That's all then." The boy hesitated, then ducked his head and turned, his slight frame disappearing quickly around the bend. She carried Jamie the rest of the way home. The light continued to fall, and as they reached their door, the world behind them had already turned grey. Inside the cottage, she fed Jamie the remaining oat bread from the morning and heated broth over the fire. He was too tired to speak, and after eating, he curled up on the cot without protest. She sat beside him until his breathing deepened, the sound of the hearth softening as the flames sank low. Still, she hesitated. The risk was obvious. A woman seen stepping out at twilight, cloak drawn, eyes scanning shadows. It would take only one villager glancing through their window to shape a rumor that could last a lifetime. And there would be no defense, no witness who would believe her innocence. But she could not ignore what clawed at her. She rose quietly, wrapped herself in the heavy wool cloak that had once belonged to her husband, and slipped through the door without making a sound. The night air was sharper now, filled with the scent of damp heather and wood smoke. The village was still, curtains drawn, candles lit behind fogged glass. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she moved quickly past the square, keeping close to the hedges. The wind had dropped, leaving the world hushed and expectant. Only the occasional drip of water from eaves or the rustle of leaves betrayed movement. When she reached the chapel yard, she paused. The stone path curved behind the church, where the wall was low and the moss thick with years of rain. She stepped around the corner, eyes adjusting to the deepening dusk. He was there. Sebastian stood just beyond the stone wall, one gloved hand resting lightly on the moss, his coat unfastened, the dark wool lifting slightly in the breeze. His face was shadowed, but his eyes, those unreadable eyes, met hers the moment she stepped into view. She said nothing, waiting. "I owe you more than a thank you," he said quietly. His voice was different now, lower, tinged with a tension that wasn't quite regret. "You did more than mend a wheel." She watched him closely, her hands buried in the folds of her cloak. "I've seen people measure others by the weight of their silence," he continued, almost to himself, "by how well they keep their place. You didn't, and they don't know what to do with that." Eleanor tilted her head, skeptical but listening. "I know what it is," he said, looking at the wall rather than her. "To be watched, to be spoken about, to be called something you're not, over and over, until you begin to wonder if they're right." There was no bitterness in his tone, only weariness. She took a small step closer. The moon was beginning to rise behind the church, its pale light catching the line of his jaw, the curve of his brow. She could see the way his expression softened when she didn't speak, as if her silence offered him space he hadn't found in years. She folded her arms across her chest. "Why ask me here?" His eyes lifted to hers. "Because I needed to say it away from them, not for show, not because of pity." Her heart beat faster, steady and aching. He took a breath. "And because I want—" A rustling, sharp, sudden. Both turned, alert. From the darkness just behind the hedgerow, a branch cracked beneath a careless step. Then another. Footsteps. Too quick to be coincidence. The footsteps grew closer, measured, deliberate, as though the owner wanted to be heard but not hurried. Each step crunched softly over the gravel, dragging through the hedge brush with no attempt to disguise approach. Eleanor's muscles locked in place, her breath caught behind her ribs. Beside her, Sebastian straightened as well, shoulders drawing back, one hand still resting on the moss-covered wall, but now clenched. From the shadows beneath the trees, the faint flicker of firelight emerged. A lantern. Its flame danced and dipped with the breeze, casting long gold streaks across the uneven stones. Then the figure stepped fully into view. Mr. Aldridge. His broad frame filled the narrow path, shoulders hunched slightly beneath his coat, the lantern swinging low in one hand. His boots moved without hesitation, squelching in the soft dirt, until he stood only a few paces from where Eleanor and Sebastian faced him. The glow from the lantern lit half his face, jaw tight, eyes glittering. He looked not surprised, not exactly, but not indifferent. His gaze moved slowly from Sebastian's uncovered head to Eleanor's cloak, still pulled tightly around her shoulders. He lingered there a fraction too long. His eyes, though shaded, betrayed something hard and speculative. Then he looked between the two of them, taking in the quiet distance that still existed and weighing it, calculating it. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he inclined his head stiffly. "Evening, sir," he said flatly, addressing Sebastian alone. Greystone did not flinch. "Mr. Aldridge." Aldridge didn't look at Eleanor directly. He didn't need to. The heat of his awareness scorched her just the same. His silence toward her was loud, a judgment not spoken, but fully formed. It hung there between them, thicker than fog, heavier than lantern smoke. Then, without another word, he continued past. Not in haste, not like a man embarrassed or on an errand. No, he walked slow, as if granting them every second of his retreat, each step an announcement that he had seen what he had come to see, and would carry it away like a sharpened blade sheathed for now, but ready. Eleanor remained still long after the sound of his boots faded. Only the wind moved now, whispering through the damp trees above. The spell was broken. The words that had begun to form between her and Sebastian moments earlier were gone, swallowed whole by Aldridge's presence. She could feel the heat rising up her throat, not shame exactly, but something close. A furious awareness that the world had no intention of allowing her to exist quietly, even in this small corner of dusk. Sebastian shifted beside her. "We should walk back." She nodded, unable to find words. They didn't speak again as they left the chapel path. The road back to the village was lined with silence, neither companionable nor cold, only weighted by the echo of footsteps that no longer sounded behind them. They took separate lanes when they neared the first cottages, parting without discussion. She turned down the alley behind the old tannery, where the stones were worn and slick, and slipped through the side door of her cottage. The room was dim, lit only by the final embers of the fire and the faint moonlight that crept through the shutters. Jamie was asleep, curled on his side with one arm thrown over the woolen blanket. His breathing was steady, undisturbed. Eleanor leaned against the door and closed it softly behind her. She exhaled. Tomorrow would come with eyes. That much she knew, and she was right. By morning, the change was palpable. The hush fell over her like a second skin as soon as she stepped into the square. It wasn't loud, not like the laughter had been. This was softer, crueler. The way two women at the well stopped pouring water when she approached. The way a man behind the mill pretended not to hear her greeting. Even the butcher's boy, who usually tossed her a lopsided grin, now looked away. At the market, she placed 2 coins on the wooden plank of the bakehouse stall. The woman behind it, a red-cheeked widow named Clara, looked at the coins, then at Eleanor and said, "We're sold out." There were loaves sitting on the shelf behind her. Eleanor picked up her coins, said nothing. The punishment was not new, but it stung all the same. It wasn't just what they assumed. It was that they were so eager for it to be true. That a woman with dirt on her palms and a child on her hip might think herself worthy of more than trade and silence. It offended them in a way no sin ever had. She left the square without finishing her errands. The ache in her chest was not sorrow. It was weariness. Later that afternoon, she walked past the stables near the inn. The smell of straw and horseflesh drifted toward her on the breeze. She had hoped to pass quickly, unseen, but voices stopped her. She recognized them before she saw the speakers. Mr. Aldridge, Mrs. Huxley. Their tones were low, but not soft enough to miss. They stood near the open stable doors, half shielded by the shadow of the eaves. "I don't care how highborn he is," Aldridge was saying. "He's upsetting the order here." "Indeed," came Mrs. Huxley's crisp reply. "And bringing his attentions to a woman of questionable character only adds to the impropriety." "She'll use it," Aldridge said, a sneer in his voice. "He's the kind that won't see it until it's too late." Eleanor pressed her back against the stone wall of the alley, unseen but close enough to hear each word. "She's clever," Mrs. Huxley said, thoughtful now, "but reckless. The moment will pass. All it requires is intervention." There was a pause. "I've decided to write to his family," she continued. "His people in London will want to know what sort of company he's keeping. If they have any influence left over him, they'll put an end to it." Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. Greystone had never mentioned his family, not once. And now someone else would write his story for him. The cart shed behind Eleanor's cottage smelled of wood shavings and cold iron, the scent of labor and purpose. Morning light filtered through the narrow window panes in slanted stripes, catching on the worn edges of her workbench and glinting off the iron tools arranged in orderly rows. The familiar rhythm of the day, sanding, measuring, shaping, was meant to soothe her, to ground her in something other than memory or speculation. But her hands moved without confidence, the chisel slipping more than once, her concentration fraying with every hour. She hadn't gone near the inn since overhearing Mrs. Huxley's damning promise, and Sebastian, no, Lord Ravensleigh, now that she knew, had not come near her doorstep since their brief meeting at the chapel. The change in him made sudden sense. The silence, the restraint, the weight behind his every glance, each careful word. He had not mentioned his title, and that omission now felt deliberate. Not unkind, perhaps, but undeniable. A man of his standing did not belong in a shed like this, nor in conversation with a village widow whose hands bore the stains of grease and soot. The intimacy she'd begun to imagine, tentative, fragile, now felt like a cruel mirage. He was not simply a man. He was an earl, bound to land, to expectation, to marriages arranged by bloodlines and dowries. And she was a complication. The door creaked behind her. She turned, expecting Jamie with a question or plea for bread. Instead, a familiar face peered in, nervous, soot-smudged. "Thomas?" The stable boy stepped inside, holding something in his hands. His boots were damp with morning frost, his sleeves too short at the wrists. He looked as if he'd been standing outside too long before gathering the courage to knock. "Brought this," he muttered, offering the envelope toward her. Eleanor wiped her palms on her apron before taking it. The parchment was thick, expensive, almost soft to the touch. A crest embossed in wax sealed the flap, a hawk in flight over 3 crossed swords. Not ostentatious, but old. Her stomach curled as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. Sebastian Greystone, Earl of Ravensleigh. There it was, his name in full. A title not mentioned in whispers, but printed in perfect black ink. No address, no explanation. She closed the letter and stood in the dim light for a long moment. Thomas shifted his weight from foot to foot, uncertain. "Did he say anything?" she asked. The boy shook his head. "Just said I should give it to you myself." She thanked him quietly and watched as he vanished down the lane. Her thoughts swirled, too fast to catch. Earl of Ravensleigh, not a man displaced, not a gentleman retreating into quiet, a man with lineage and history, his name no doubt printed in registers that Eleanor could never hope to enter. She folded the parchment again and slipped it beneath a drawer in her bench. Then she picked up her chisel, though her fingers were numb. A wheel yoke sat half-shaped on the bench before her. She pressed the edge of her tool into the wood again and again, even as the curve wobbled and her wrist throbbed. By noon, word had spread. She heard it from a passerby in the alley behind her cottage. Something about Mrs. Huxley's letter being posted to London at last. Eleanor didn't need to guess the contents. They would be full of clipped warnings, moral concern, and thinly veiled suggestions about the inappropriateness of a nobleman lingering too long in the company of a widow. A response might arrive within days. She knew that kind of correspondence. Swift, effective, designed to shame. That evening, she didn't light the fire. Sebastian sent no word. She didn't expect him to. He was likely told the same thing she was told now in unspoken terms. Walk away. Let the scandal fade. Let the woman become invisible again. She withdrew further over the next 3 days, avoiding the main road, refusing small jobs that required collecting payment from the inn. The quiet felt cleaner than the weight of stairs. Jamie sensed the shift, but said nothing. He played close to the house, careful not to trouble her. On the 4th day, the wind changed. The air smelled of rain, but no clouds had gathered. The village held a peculiar stillness, and Eleanor worked with the door to the shed open, letting in the breeze as she polished a finished wheel rim. The wood gleamed beneath her cloth, but there was no pleasure in it. Her mind remained elsewhere. Just before dusk, she heard the knock. Not on the front door, on the back. She paused mid-polish, heart skipping. Jamie was indoors, curled by the hearth with a book. She wiped her hands and walked to the narrow corridor between shed and cottage, stepping through the back threshold to face the visitor. She stopped cold. The man standing on her step was tall, his features strikingly similar to Sebastian's, but colder. His coat was immaculate, his cravat tied with precision, his gloves in one hand rather than worn. His gaze traveled over the modest doorway, the washed-out garden bed beside the stones, and then landed on her. Sharp, assessing. She knew who he was before he spoke. "Mrs. Hargrave, is it?" he said, voice clipped, polished with years of education and disdain. She inclined her head. Yes. He did not offer his name, did not need to. The resemblance said enough. Sebastian's brother. "I've come as a concerned party," he said, stepping forward just enough that she had to hold the door frame, "to discuss a matter of discretion." Eleanor stiffened. "If you're here about your brother—" "I am here," he said, smoothly interrupting, "to avoid embarrassment, for him and for you." His voice did not rise, but its impact landed like a slap. Cold, formal, final. He continued, "You must be aware of the implications. His presence here is already a point of conversation. His continued contact with a woman of your station, especially under circumstances already regarded as questionable, is not something a family like ours can overlook." The words struck like stone. She drew her arms around herself. "I understand," she said, though her voice shook. "If that's all—" "It isn't," he said calmly. "I'm here because you must remove yourself from the situation. Quietly, permanently. No more meetings, no further appearances near the inn, no correspondence. This must end." "Now!" Eleanor gripped the frame, her breath shallow. He stepped back, pulling his gloves into place, his expression unmoved. "You must also know that your child is not exempt from consequence. If this continues, the price may not be yours alone." Her vision blurred, not from tears, but fury. She reached for the door. He stopped just short of leaving, and added, without a trace of hesitation, "He has already been told you're no longer interested, that you've come to your senses." She closed the door with trembling fingers, but his voice slipped through the crack as it latched. "Consider this settled." The days passed in a brittle kind of silence, the kind that crept into corners and pressed itself into the joints of the house. Eleanor moved through them with the weight of something unfinished sitting behind her ribs, heavier than grief, duller than rage. It was the absence that hurt most, the unspoken questions, the unconfirmed lies, the letter never received. She did not return to the forge. She walked no farther than her garden gate. Her tools remained untouched on the bench in the cart shed, the last wheel she'd begun resting unfinished like a hollowed husk. Jamie, ever watchful, stopped asking when they would go to the green. He kept closer to the cottage, playing quietly with discarded scraps of wood, his eyes flicking toward her often, unsure. She tried to smile when he looked at her. Sometimes she managed it. No one knocked at the door. No letters came. The whispers had begun to die down, but not because the scandal had been forgotten. It was simpler than that. They had tired of her. The woman with the blackened hands and stubborn eyes had vanished back into her rightful place, silent, worn, invisible. They no longer had to look at her, or the man who'd once stood beside her. She told herself it was better this way, that this was what strength looked like, self-preservation. She had chosen safety, chosen Jamie. And yet, at night, when the fire had burned low and the wind turned in the chimney, her thoughts pulled without mercy toward the chapel lane, to the feel of the gravel beneath her boots, the rough stone of the wall beneath her fingers, to the sound of Sebastian's voice in the dark, low and careful, as though unwrapping something breakable. In that quiet, she hadn't felt small. She hadn't had to disappear. In his presence, there had been room for her. She ached for it and hated herself for aching. The week wore on. Then, on the 7th morning, the sky cracked open with wind and sun, washing the village in a strange, welcome warmth. Eleanor woke with an unfamiliar restlessness. She brushed Jamie's hair with greater care than usual, tied his scarf twice to be sure it wouldn't slip. And when he tugged on her sleeve after breakfast and asked if they might go to the edge of the green, to the tree where the crows gathered, she said yes. The ash tree stood near the outer wall, where the grass grew wild and the brambles tangled freely. Its branches reached wide and solemn, casting long shadows over the ground. Jamie darted ahead, his limp nearly gone now, a small miracle of time and youth. Eleanor followed at a slower pace, her skirts brushing against dried leaves, her heart moving faster than her feet. She didn't see him at first. Not until she turned to call Jamie back and saw the shape standing beyond the tree's reach at the edge of the hedgerow. Sebastian. He wore no cloak, no hat, only his dark coat, open at the collar, and gloves that hung unused in one hand. He stood with a stillness that didn't resemble fear or arrogance, just uncertainty. His posture was straight, but not expectant. He looked like a man trying not to move too soon, like he might dissolve if he misstepped. Before she could stop him, Jamie saw him too. The boy cried out and ran, feet churning over the frost-softened grass. "Mr. Greystone!" Eleanor's breath caught. Sebastian bent almost instinctively, arms outstretched, catching Jamie in a steady embrace. He crouched as Jamie spoke to him with eager words Eleanor couldn't hear. He smiled, small but real, and something in the way his head bowed to listen undid the last of her resolve. She walked forward, slowly. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting, gentle, uncertain, reverent. He stood as Jamie stepped back, and now it was only the two of them in that sliver of space beneath the ash tree. She spoke first. "I know who you are," she said, voice quiet but steady. "Sebastian Greystone, Earl of Ravensleigh." He didn't respond, not right away. His face gave nothing away. "I know about the letter Mrs. Huxley sent," she added, "and about the man you sent to my door, your brother." Sebastian's eyes sharpened. "He came to you?" Eleanor nodded. "He said I was a danger to your reputation, and he said you were already informed that I no longer wished to see you." Sebastian stepped closer, his voice low. "That's not true." "I thought it was," she said. "For days I believed you'd washed your hands of it all. Of me. I thought you'd chosen silence." "I came to the forge," he said. "Twice. Mrs. Huxley told me you'd asked not to be disturbed again, that you wanted peace." She let out a breath, the edges of it trembling. So the separation wasn't ours then. It was theirs. Something in his face shifted just slightly. Grief, slow and dawning. "I had a letter," he said. "Meant for you. I gave it to Thomas after the chapel. He swore he left it with someone you trusted." "No one gave me anything," she said softly. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, fingers slipping past folded fabric, and drew it out. A square of parchment, creased and damp at the edges. He offered it to her with a steady hand. She didn't open it. Not yet. She looked at him instead. The silence between them stretched, filled with things they hadn't said. A dozen moments stolen, all of them bent under the weight of things they weren't allowed to want. But now, this moment, this choice. Then, footsteps. Eleanor turned sharply, the muscles in her back stiffening. From the tree line beyond the hedge, boots moved through wet grass, slow, measured. A figure stepped into view. Mr. Aldridge. He held no lantern this time, no hammer or apron, just his own rigid posture. His arms crossed as he came into full view. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those pale, sharp eyes, moved from Eleanor to Sebastian, to the letter still clutched in her hand, and back again. He said nothing. He didn't need to. because the look he gave them was not just of disapproval, it was calculation, of power, of consequence. And behind him, not far behind, two more shadows approached. Mr. Aldridge, for all the weight he carried in the village with his hammer and his name, did not speak. He stood just beyond the ash tree, arms folded tightly across his chest, chin lifted as if the height of his silence could convey something deeper than words. His gaze was as cold as the air, narrowed on Eleanor with restrained accusation, flicking briefly to Sebastian like a silent reprimand meant for both of them. But he did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not wield his influence today with fire or fury. He simply stood. And it was enough to make the air taut with judgment. But Eleanor did not lower her eyes. Not this time. The folded letter in her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something else. Determination, long kept at bay, now pressing through. She moved closer to Sebastian, not with hesitance, but with quiet purpose, and tucked the letter into the fold of her cloak. Then she turned and nodded once toward the path leading back toward the cottages. He followed without question. They walked side by side in silence, past the hedgerow and across the green. Mr. Aldridge didn't follow. He simply watched, a lone figure beneath the reaching limbs of the ash, growing smaller in the distance. Behind them, the sun dipped low, staining the edges of the village with pale gold and dusty rose. The whispers resumed even before they reached the well road. She could hear them, faint clicks of disapproval, hushed judgments behind windows, but they no longer lodged in her skin like barbs. They skimmed past her as they walked, as if her silence itself had changed in meaning. She was not hiding anymore. She was choosing. And that, perhaps, unsettled them more than any imagined affair. That evening, when the village lamps flickered into life and the wind moved like breath through the alleys, Eleanor sat across from Sebastian in her kitchen. The hearth was lit, casting long shadows against the stone, and Jamie had long since fallen asleep in the loft, unaware that the quiet had changed shape downstairs. Sebastian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his coat hung over the back of his chair, his waistcoat wrinkled from the hours they'd spent walking and speaking in low, careful tones. He told her of the house he'd grown up in, not grand but cold, of a mother who had been devout and frightened, and a father who valued reputation above warmth, of a brother who had embraced the obligations of their title with surgical precision, leaving Sebastian to carry the weight of rebellion, of the estates passed into his name upon their father's death, and the first years spent stumbling through Parliament and winter balls and suitors introduced with steely smiles. And then the failure. He didn't name the woman. He didn't need to. He had left London not because he was ruined, but because he had begun to believe that what the world wanted from him was an illusion, one he was not willing to maintain. Titles mean nothing if you have to trade your soul to wear them, he said. But no one tells you that until you already have. Eleanor watched the light shift on his face, the fire catching gold at his temple. When it was her turn, she told him about the years after her husband died, about the quiet terror of debt, of hunger, of finding work no one thought her capable of, about Aldridge refusing her the first time she asked for scrap iron, about the baker turning her away when she offered her last coin. She told him how long it had taken for her to stop expecting rescue, and then, her voice lower, she added, "I don't care what they say anymore. Not if truth costs less than silence." It was not a declaration of love. Not yet. But it was something closer to freedom, and Sebastian took her hand across the table, holding it lightly, as though afraid anything firmer might make the moment vanish. The next morning dawned cloudless, the air crisp, but no longer sharp. Eleanor rose early and wrote a letter. Not long, not angry. There were no accusations, no demands. Just a line of truth. "I am no longer under your authority." She addressed it to Mrs. Huxley. She walked alone to the chapel, climbed the time-worn stone steps, and delivered it with her own hand, placing it directly into the parish box outside the vicar's door. Then she turned, lifted her chin, and walked back through the center of Thistlebrook with the certainty of a woman who had nothing left to beg for. By midday, word had found its way into every corner of the village. Some were outraged. A few openly scorned her as she passed, their glares sharp, their silence louder. But others watched her with a strange, new curiosity. That afternoon, 2 women arrived with carts in need of work. Mrs. Ives with a splintered shaft, and the baker's cousin with a broken spoke. They didn't apologize. They didn't speak of shame. They simply waited patiently as Eleanor examined the damage, gave her a fair price, and took her measurements with care. It was enough. Sebastian did not hide, not anymore. He returned to the inn each night, but his days were spent in the open. He greeted the smith without hesitation, purchased supplies himself, and spent more time with Thomas than anyone else, teaching him how to polish harness brass and rebind the frayed lines on an old saddle. Children whispered that the stranger at the inn smiled now. Adults stopped staring quite so long. Jamie began running to meet him each morning, and no one stopped him. The change was not immediate, but slow, the way ice melts, one breath of warmth at a time. By the week's end, Eleanor stood in her garden with a basket of shavings in one hand, Jamie tugging at her skirts, when a rider arrived. Not the Viscount. A courier, pale with sweat, bearing a letter with a London seal and a wary expression. "For Mrs. Hargrave," he said. "By hand." She took it, her breath tight. She didn't open it. Instead, she waited until the light softened in the evening, until the village square turned to amber and the chimneys began their nightly sighs. Then she walked with the letter pressed against her palm, back to the green, back to the place where the coach had broken down, where the jeers had started, where the wheel had cracked and everything after it had been forced to turn. He was already there. Sebastian stood with one hand resting on the same low post he had leaned on days ago. His coat was buttoned, his boots dusty. He looked up when she approached, his eyes catching hers not with uncertainty now, but quiet hope. She reached him. He said nothing at first. Then he spoke. "I don't want your forgiveness," he said. "Only the chance to ask if you'll try." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The wind shifted softly across the green, and for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the world around her fall still. Weeks later, the village of Thistlebrook had returned to its quiet rhythm, as if nothing had ever stirred beneath its surface. The gossip had slowed, then scattered, like the last brittle leaves falling from winter branches. No proclamation was pinned to the chapel doors, no banns read aloud from the pulpit. But those who paid attention noticed the shift. It was in the way she walked the market path without glancing down, the way he no longer kept to the shadows. There was no wedding, but there was something far less theatrical and far more binding. Sebastian had purchased a modest house near the forest's edge, a half-mile from the old ash tree, and a world away from the London drawing rooms that once suffocated him. The cottage, stone-fronted and ivy-clad, sat on a small rise overlooking the fields where deer sometimes grazed in the early morning. It had 2 rooms with uneven floors, a leaking corner in the kitchen ceiling, and a hearth large enough to warm the entire house when the wind turned cold. It was perfect. Eleanor visited often. Some mornings she brought Jamie, his satchel packed with bread and chalk for his lessons. Other times she came alone, sleeves rolled, hands marked with the familiar smudges of work. There were days she helped repair the gate to the pasture, others where she sat on the low stone wall with a cup of tea, speaking little, saying everything. Their time together had no performance, no design. Just the quiet comfort of 2 people who had come to understand each other without needing to explain every piece. It was not the life Eleanor had imagined. Not in those early days after Nathaniel's death, when fear had shaped her every thought. Nor during the long nights she'd spent scraping together work to buy Jamie's next pair of boots. And it was not the life Sebastian's family had imagined for him either, but it was the life they had chosen. And that choice made it theirs. Jamie took to his new routine easily. The tutor Sebastian had arranged, a quiet man from York with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, came 3 afternoons a week and taught from books worn thin at the spine. Jamie, always curious, bloomed beneath the structure. He began to draw wheels and levers in the margins of his lessons. He spoke of constellations and French verbs, and Eleanor sometimes found herself blinking in disbelief at how quickly he was leaving childhood behind. Eleanor's cart repair business, once mocked, grew in quiet ways. She expanded her shed with the help of a neighbor's discarded beams and a month of slow labor. She took on apprentices, 2 boys and a girl, each from families who could barely afford shoes, let alone training. She paid them in coin when she could, in food when she couldn't, and taught them as much about pride as she did about wheel joints and axle balance. The same mouths that had once scorned her now sent their sons to learn under her hands. What had been scandal slowly turned to novelty, then familiarity, and at last a kind of acceptance. It was not perfect. Some whispers remained. There were still glances from across pews on Sunday mornings, or a paused conversation when she entered the bakery. But she had learned to let those moments pass. So had Sebastian. They learned to live with the echoes. And then, without fanfare or triumph, they learned to ignore them. On a spring afternoon softened by sun and distant birdsong, Eleanor and Sebastian walked together along the narrow lane that led toward the ash tree. The grass on either side had grown tall, pale green with gold tips swaying in the breeze. A pair of larks darted through the sky above them, and the air held that unmistakable scent of new earth and wildflowers not yet in bloom. They said little as they walked. They rarely needed words. Eleanor's skirts brushed the tops of the grass, the hem damp with dew, and Sebastian's stride matched hers without thought, his hand resting loosely at his side until the wind shifted again and she reached for it. He didn't look at her when she did. He didn't need to. Her fingers curled into his, sure and steady. Just ahead, set beside a low stone wall near the woods, stood the small shed that now held the coach, the very one that had broken on the village road all those weeks ago. It no longer bore its crest. The leather had been cleaned, the wood re-varnished, but it had not been replaced. Inside, resting quietly beneath a cotton sheet, the wheel still bore Eleanor's brace. He had not repaired it. He had not replaced it with something finer. It remained there, a piece of her, flawed and necessary, built under strain and judgment, and strong enough to hold. They passed the shed and reached the ash tree, the same one where Jamie had once run without pause toward a man neither of them had yet known. The breeze whispered through the tall grass, brushing their ankles, bending but not breaking. He lifted their joined hands slightly, turning his to press his thumb across her knuckles in a gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone watching. But there was no one watching. No one but the tree and the sky and the memory of that broken wheel. And under that open sky, no declarations were made, no vows spoken, just a quiet growing truth between them, one that needed no audience, no ceremony, only constancy and the strength to stay. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. What did you think of this story? Was there a moment that touched your heart the most? Maybe the scene at the wheel, or the quiet strength between Eleanor and Sebastian as they finally chose love on their own terms. I'd love to know what resonated with you, so please, leave a comment and share your thoughts. I truly enjoy reading each one, and your voice helps this story reach even more hearts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.